Hello friends, I am Rob the Dungeon Tutor, and today I am going to be making this video upon request by a friend of mine, David, who wants me to take a look at a free role-playing game known as Mazes and Minotaurs. Now, Mazes and Minotaurs is kind of an unusual game, to be honest. It's a take on a concept. What would happen if the founders of role-playing games, specifically Dungeons and Dragons, instead of falling in love with Tolkien's fantasy, instead fell in love with Grecian mythology? From some of the earlier movies that had been made about the Greek adventures and Greek and Roman interplays. That is an interesting idea in that, you know, instead of having a greater focus on magical items, for instance, like the One Ring, magical swords, things of that nature, instead of having, you know, heavy armor and mythical races of elves and dwarves and the like, instead they went from the very fertile ground of Greek mythology. And this came as an idle conversation from people who were writing about role-playing games, and eventually the right person met up with the right person and they decided to make a game of it. So, the creators of this game, the person who initially came up with the concept, and in this I'm going to have to refer to my notes. This was a gentleman by the name of Paul Elliott, and he hooked up with a game designer, Olivier Legrand. And the two of them together ended up making Mazes and Minotaurs. Now, the concept of the game, fairly straightforward. It's a look at 1970s era role-playing in its infancy, and what would happen if you, instead of, you know, convoluting things with all of the details that, say, you know, Gary Gygax himself wrote into the fabric of role-playing games with its kind of wordiness and high level of complications with rules and such. Although I know, yes, more complicated rules would eventually come out, but still. Instead, you stripped everything down to very simple concepts, but still kept a lot of what made Dungeons and Dragons in terms of the possibility of doing heroic deeds and fighting fearsome monsters. Well, you could then have something that might have been somewhat similar to Mazes and Monsters. Now, I'm just going to cover the 50-page player's handbook for now. This is for the revised version of Mazes and Monsters, which has 12 classes and lays out the rules, character creation, everything in general. There's a lot that's hidden behind the Monstrous Manual and the Maze Master's Guide. That's, yeah, their Dungeon Master. But I just figured I'd cover this so that if you're interested in a role-playing game, you might think to yourself, oh, I could use something that's free, and take a look at it. First of all, this game uses two types of dice, 20-sided dice and 6-sided dice, and that's really it. This may be an oversimplification for some, but actually it's fairly true to the roots of role-playing games in general. And you can do quite a lot with that. In terms of raw probability, the 20-sided die is very adequate. It's comfortable to roll for most people. It's pretty common these days. You can find them even in, you know, your local, not just your local hobby shops. If you even have one of those, but big box retailers are now carrying them. Dollar stores are carrying gaming dice. So getting your hands on 20-sided dice isn't as hard as it once was. Also, the 6-sided dice is incredibly common and actually is fairly adequate for a range of low 1 to high 6, being decent enough of a spread that it's actually meaningful. Especially when you bring the number ranges for many of the things down, as they do in this game. Your characters don't get to, you know, super heroic levels of, you know, having hundreds of hit points or anything of that nature, so that's actually pretty good. So, the basic of the core of this idea, first of all, I want to just get this out of the way. Number one, the game is very tongue-in-cheek. It's written on a fictional timeline where this game actually came out in 1972, whereas Dungeons & Dragons came out in 1974. They play around with a lot of things. This is something they very much had a lot of fun with. That being said, it is a role-playing game with decently solid mechanics, so I'm treating this as such. Their humor is fine. If you are familiar with the history of role-playing games, you'll probably enjoy a couple of the tongue-in-cheek references, and that's perfectly fine. The other thing I'm just going to warn you about, the art quality is all over the place. There's some pretty bad pictures, especially when it comes to the human form. Some of the things they do is just not attractive or good. And I'm not saying everybody is attractive, but some of they're almost to the level of grotesque. Plus, full frontal nudity. So, you know, for the section on nymphs. Yeah, they like that. And they're not shy of referencing it. Hey, you know, what's better than women in chainmail bikinis? Full frontal on nymphs. So, that is something that you'll have to get around in this game if that's a problem. If it's not a problem, then you're welcome to it. I wouldn't say any of it is really erotic, you know, so you don't have to worry about anything too graphic, but it's there, and, you know, you should know about these things in advance. Most of the art, okay, pretty much all of the art is based on the kind of art that you would commonly see in examples of classic Greek sculpture and imagery, like on clay pots and that, where you see very stylized images. It fits along that lines with you know, it's actually a kind of a clever idea. Rather than having to go with fine art, you go with something that's recognizable, certainly. And also they have fun with the fact that everybody's naked, but they all have cloths that, you know, cover and drape appropriately. There's one with a bard who's got just basically a scarf that he's got an appropriately placed fig leaf. You know, things like that. But it's part of the charm. It's also kind of, it's all right. So it's functional. We'll just go with it's functional. So, basis of the game. There's 3 different types of classes. You have your warrior classes, you have your magic classes, and then you have a couple of tacked on specialist classes. The specialist classes they're hunters and thieves. So hunters can hunt, and they're good with missile weapons. Thieves can steal things and hide. Neither of them are particularly heroic, but yeah, they're there. They're fine. Traps and the like really aren't the focus of this game like they are in Dungeons and Dragons. So there are no real references to your thieves being expert at removing traps and things like that. I think they're going to have a more open view on things of that nature. But, you know, those classes are there. Now, as far as the warrior classes, again, this is the revised, so there's a total of 12 classes. You have Amazons, Barbarians, Centaurs, Nobles, and Spearmen. Okay. So, the Amazons, now remember, the Amazons in history would have no truck with men. Here, they're just warrior women. Okay, they're fine. Barbarians are anybody who is not from the Hellenistic culture, primarily. Technically, the Amazons are kind of barbarians in their own way, but that's fine. These are the barbarians of the grim Norsemen. You've got, and anybody really north of, again, the cradle of civilization of Hellenic culture. So you've got, you know, the Gauls and the Goths, as well as the Celts, and, you know, all of them up there. Generally typified by being very strong and angry. That's how they go. Centaurs. Now this is one thing that may give some people fits. Centaurs can only be males. No female centaur adventurers. That's flat out, nope, they don't exist. They just stay in their herds and they're meek and submissive. Some people are going to have a problem with that. And again, I'll tell you right now, that's one of the things that is an issue in this, is that 1970s sentimentalities were a little different. Anybody who's read the original Advanced Dungeons & Dragons knows girls weren't necessarily allowed to have high stats as some of the boys in some things. That was a part of their game, which undoubtedly turned off a lot of people. Now, these days, that's not an issue in any modern game, but here it is. If you're going to be a centaur, it can't be a feisty centaur lass. You've got to be a passionate centaur male to be a centaur in this game. Now, like any role-playing game, you can do with it as you want, but they don't mention provisions against making this game your own. This is how it is played. Nobles, they are the nobility, and the spearmen are more of your hoplites. They are the spear and shield warriors, and they have advantages that let them excel at that. The magicians, those who use magic, are elementalists. Pick 2 elemental forces, and you have your magical abilities. Lyricists, they use lyres, but they're your bards, basically. They use magical songs. Nymphs, all females, all children of the gods, functionally immortal. They have their own magical powers, and many of them are wrapped up in their feminine wiles. So, yeah. And there's a variety of different nymphs based on the different elements and biomes. So you have swamp nymphs, you have valley nymphs, you have forest nymphs. So, and those, of course, have their names. They're the nereids, the naiads, the dryads. And then you have priests, who channel the will of the gods, and sorcerers, who use basically mystical mind magics to enslave and ensnare the senses. So, that's all of the classes. Now, before we get into specifics on that, again, bear in mind this is the idea of taking an approach from a different skewed perspective from how Dungeons & Dragons turned out. Because the way that Tolkien's magics worked, which was very much tell not show, there's not a lot of obvious and blatant magic in their world. And in the Greek world, a lot of the magic was, like mystical forces of nature, and they could be very profound and transformative. That's generally going to have an impact on how the characters are. Also, the focus, again, is not necessarily on slapping on as much armor as possible, and, the toughest characters were, plate armor and carry around big swords. In this world, traveling lighter and being more active in your defense was far more important. Matter of fact, there's only 3 pieces of armor in the game that count: your breastplate, your helmet, and your shield. So it's and a lot of the characters will eschew wearing a breastplate armor because it hampers them too much. It's interesting to think about. But there's going to be some pretty profound differences that you'll see as we go. Now, generating characters may feel awfully familiar, but they tend towards a more heroic level. It's 2d6 and adds 6 for 6 attributes. So, it's like Dungeons & Dragons 3d6, except you're giving yourself a 1/6 for free out of those 2. So, you're going for a range from 7 to 18. So, you're not really going to have any terribly tragic attributes. All of them, at the very least, are going to be subpar, but not abysmal. And it's also going to lead to a higher range of abilities that are going to give you bonuses in the end. The attributes are might, strength, skill, roughly dexterity, wits, it's about a slice of half of your wisdom, luck, the greatest stat in the game, and I'll explain why in a second, will, the other half of that wisdom equation, and grace, your charisma. Intelligence and constitution are kind of tied up. Your constitutional advantages are basically tied into your class. So if you are a warrior, you're going to have more hit points than a wizard will. As far as making resistances and things like that, a lot of those things are going to be built around luck and your might or whatever is the applicable attribute. And there are saving throws for a variety of things. We'll cover that. But again, those are your basic attributes. Now, for many things in the game, those numbers don't mean a terrible amount. Instead, it goes on the bonuses that each one give you, much like Dungeons and Dragons, honestly. If you have an AD&D, a character with a 14 in your dexterity, that's not going to matter a tremendous amount. What will matter would be your bonus or lack thereof, and your bonus to strike with missile weapons, your bonus to your armor class, or to an initiative score, something like that. This is much the same way, except that that bonus is going to be applied to a number of iterative scores. So having high stats is never a bad thing. In some cases, it's really, really going to be essential to having a character that's stacked up the way you want, so that you can have quite effective characters right out of the bat, especially if you're rolling well. Your overall attribute bonuses are arrayed much like you'd see in, say, something like Dungeons and Dragons. It's at the very top end at a 19 and 20, I believe is a +4. Yeah, +4. 18, 17 is +3. 15, 16 +2. 14, 13 +1. You know, unless I might be off by 1, but you know, it's generally going to be arrayed in a way that you're familiar with if you've played anything like a Dungeons and Dragons game. Easy enough to do. You can put the bonuses down for all of your stats. Maybe if you rolled abysmally, you might have 1 or 2 with a penalty. But in this game, because you're supposed to be heroic, if your totals for all of your attributes don't add up to 75 or over, they encourage you to just re-roll. And if you don't have at least 2 rolls that ended up in a 13 or better, re-roll as well. That's right in the rules. So your characters are going to be definitely on the plus side of overall potence. Now, most of your actual scores that you're going to be referring to again and again are going to be based off of those numbers. Not using those numbers specifically unless there's some fairly obvious choices, like, for instance, testing your might to lift something. You'd use your might bonus for that. But for things like melee combat, your melee combat is equal to your might bonus plus your skill bonus plus your luck bonus. So your might, in terms of your raw strength and being able to punch through somebody's defenses, your skill in employing that might to best get through your opponent's defenses, and luck, because luck affects just about everything. So those 3 things together, if they're all positive modifiers, might give you a pretty decent number in the end. That's going to be contested again and again against your opponent's defensive bonus. Now, your basic defensive class is equal to 12 plus your luck bonus. That's if you have no armor on. For every piece of armor that you have, a helmet, breastplate, shield, that adds an additional +2 for each of those things. Also, many of the classes give you bonuses in certain circumstances. For instance, a bonus equal to one of your attribute bonuses whenever you're defending against somebody in melee, because you're particularly graceful, because you're particularly skilled at using your weapon to block and make your approach to attack you difficult. So in the end, your number generally tends to be the target number for your opponent's attack bonus, and a stock character is going to have something to the tune of between a 13 and possibly as high as a 20 in some things. Which, again, fits pretty well with the progression of bonuses that you get to attack, all the different things that add to your attack roll, plus a d20 roll to try to get to your opponent's effective defense class. Pretty straightforward. And because your characters don't have some other attribute like an attack bonus or THAC or anything like that to ratchet up as you level, the numbers will change a little bit as you go along, but for the most part, they really keep everything in perspective. Nothing shoots out into the superhuman range where you're going to have to learn higher math. You're not going to have to recalculate these numbers very often either. But when they do change, you'll have to make note of that. Your missile attacks are equal to your skill plus your wits plus your luck. So again, your dexterity, your wits to calculate, what you need to hit, and of course luck. So, that's relatively straightforward. Again, you're aiming for that defensive class. Your initiative is equal to 10 plus your skill bonus plus your wits bonus. Now, again, I'm perfectly fine with, a person's agility being used for dexterity, your reflexiveness, your wits, how fast your mental acuity is to keep you in. Adding the two together and adding it to a bonus gives you your initiative score. Now, you don't roll for initiative. You just have a flat score. I'm okay with that for its simplicity. I kind of cringe at it a little bit because it kind of makes things the same old every round. But realistically, I guess that does make sense. A person that you know of who has the fastest reflexes is usually going to be the first one to go first. And that would help you to, say, arrange the seating arrangement so that everybody is in proper order, only being interrupted when you have an opponent who fits into the initiative order. So that's fine. Your total hits are based on your class. If you're a warrior class, you have 12. If you are a magician class, you have 8. If you're a specialist, a hunter or a rogue, or a hunter or a thief, you have 10. And then you also add your might bonus to that. So the extra muscle that you got makes you a little beefier. Your might is often going to be used in place of things that constitution or some other stat like that would be used for, and that's fine. That's another thing that's common with a lot of other games. Then you have a variety of saving rolls. Pretty much what you would use saving rolls for anything else. Your athletic prowess is your might, your skill, and your luck. Seems to make sense, right? All those things that would apply to anything that you are trying to save against that your body and movement can help with. Yeah, absolutely. Your danger evasion, your will, your skill, and your luck. Okay. If that's your twitch reflexes, that's getting out of harm's way as opposed to getting past a danger that you can obviously see. So you would use your athletic prowess if, say, you have to vault over a scything blade that you can see coming, and if suddenly something blows flame at you, you would have to use your danger evasion. Okay, that makes sense. Your physical vigor, your might, your will, and your luck. This is against resisting things like poison, gross physical threats that you have to kind of muscle and tough your way through or get through by sheer force of will. Again, makes sense. Your mystic fortitude. This is all of your resistances against magic, really, are your will, your wits, and your luck. So your mental stats. Notice that luck has been in just about every one of those. There's a reason why I said luck seems to be the most important stat in the game. It modifies just about everything, and just as much as any of the other stats do. So if your character is really strong or really lucky, it's effectively the same if you're doing something that's going to involve, some sort of physical test. The lucky person has as much of a chance to win as a strong person in some of these things. So, it's kind of an interesting system. And again, luck applies to a variety of skills that can keep you alive. So, prioritizing luck isn't necessarily a bad thing, because there's a couple of classes that have their prime requisite is luck, like Nymph, for instance. Nymphs use grace and luck, so luck is awfully handy. Nobles have luck as one of their prime requisites, so... okay, I think it's a little overbalanced, but I'm sure there are some tests that you can do that don't take luck into the equation. Like an arm wrestling contest should be pure might. Luck shouldn't have a great deal to do with any of it. So in all of those, when you're rolling against any test that I just mentioned, it's going to be a 20-sided die plus your stat, which is a bonus. Very few times, again, with the character conceit, are you going to actually have a penalty for any of these? So it's highly unlikely that you would actually have a penalized roll for a d20 for any of these. But the mechanic would be there if you did. Your personal charisma is your will, your grace, and your luck. Those are used in reaction rolls, and there are reaction rolls in this game, as is common for some early games. Hunter's hunting. skill and wits, no luck involved. Which, if anybody's ever hunted, you know that luck is such a huge part of... If you aren't lucky enough to have game come in front of you, you aren't catching anything. So I think it's hilarious that luck isn't included there, but okay. Thieving, wits and luck. No skill involved? Really? Again, kind of unusual, certainly, but okay. That's fine. Yeah, I do have a few qualms with some of these derived skills, but they're functional. As long as you know what the numbers are fairly in front of you before you play, then you shouldn't be too surprised when something comes up. It's like, wow, my thief, who's really, really agile and skillful, has to rely on the fact that he's really lucky in order to get through these the thieving tests. Okay. One of the things I'm also going to say too. This works so hard at going back to the 70s aesthetic that things that we've kind of come to cherish as ideas like balance, out the window. These classes are not balanced. They don't pretend to be balanced. They are very clearly done for either the cool factor or to make it feel like the old days. So, for instance, if you want to play Centaur, for instance, your Centaur is going to find that other people, like say the nobles, will be, increasing the attributes that they want to increase at a given time. They have more freedom. Some of their advantages can be awfully nice. Centaurs would be absolutely miserable in any enclosed environment. So they already have that going against them. And their advantage that they can shoot missile weapons on the run doesn't help them in enclosed environments or small spaces at all. So Centaurs aren't going to be very commonly chosen as player characters, I would think, unless somebody really loves Centaurs. It's just, yeah, you take the good with the bad. There are some classes that are clearly very good for one particular thing, and then you just kind of catch as catch can for anything else that you do. For instance, spearmen should never fight without their spears because too many of their advantages come with their spears. It's tied strictly into your gear. So if any enemy decides to break your weapon or deprive you of your weapon, you're kind of hosed. A spearman should have like 3 spears on them at all times, just in case one gets broken or lost. But also, the classes are really stilted. They're really, really driven exclusively towards one avenue of play. All of your bonuses that you have, you pretty much get at the beginning. There's nothing as you go up levels. It's just giving you more of what you already have. More hit points, more magic points if you're a magic class, and a bonus to a couple of attributes. Your character is not going to learn new tricks. There's not cross-classing or anything like that. You can't go and pick up somebody else's abilities and advancements. That's not how this game works. So people who have played something like 5th edition or, oh god, 3rd edition Dungeons & Dragons, you're going to feel confined in this game. It's going to feel like you have no choices after your initial choice of which class you took. That will be fine for some people. There are people who like playing those kind of games. But anybody who's played with a game with a bit more freedom is going to feel like that's really, really going to be missing in this game. Likewise, as hinting back at some of the more primitive games, overall your options in this kind of game is going to be relatively straightforward. The I move forward and attack is going to be by far the most common thing that you do, is one thing that you do again and again and again and again. There's not a wide range of options as far as different things that your characters can do. Your spellcasters now. The spellcasters are a little bit different. They have totally different stats. They have an arcane acuity spell. Their total mastery of magic. They have power points to draw from. Their mastery of magic sets the difficulty to resisting their magic. And depending on their class, Different spells cost different amount of power points depending on the height of the power. Some of it doesn't seem complete. Well, like I said before, balance is kind of out the window, but some of them are really pretty harsh in terms of how the divide goes. For instance, if you're playing an elementalist, most of your classes pay 1 point of power per level of spell. And there's not, lines and lines and lines of spells. There's a spell effect at a particular level, which I kind of appreciate, honestly. I think players who get overwhelmed by the range of different magical options will find this to be rather refreshing. Hey, if my priest wants to cast a blessing from the god, and I follow Hephaestus, for instance, I can use my power, and Hephaestus blesses you. You get a +2 to your, say, your defensive class. So now you're harder to hit. Hephaestus is watching over you and has strengthened your armor, my friend. Go forth and do great things. And then later on, you're like, okay, I want to call down Hephaestus's might and smite you. And that can take up 5 power points for that. And bam! Okay. Your elementalist, on the other hand, costs 2 points per spell level for their spells, and they only have 3 spell levels for their effects. So your elementalist is like, oh, you're bad, I'm going to summon up a little whirlwind to ensnare you. 2 power points. Okay. Now, I'm not saying that things have to be perfectly balanced. Let's face it. The priest is doing his thing and buffing people, and that's going to be most of his stuff. And calling down extreme effects on people is really going to be draining on them. An elementalist conjuring out effects on people is something that they kind of do, so it's expected. It is a bit draining, but when they call down the thunder, it's some pretty impressive stuff. A 3rd level fire spell, for instance, is a volcanic eruption. Just and yeah, it's going to cost them 6 points to do that. Whereas if a priest wants to try to get divine intervention, have their god show up and party, well, that's going to cost them 6 points, plus they have to then roll percentile dice to see if they can get their god's attention. That's a 2% chance per level. So if you're first level, you got well, yeah, you can see how this is going to go. Unless you're fairly high level, and it's never going to be a guarantee. Yeah. So, the magic is kind of all over the place. The dryads, powers are based on their background, their orientation. Some of them can be pretty nasty. Again, imagining all of the various magical transformations and powers that divine influences have in Greek mythology. Some pretty impressive ones, like turning a person into a tree. Yeah, the right ones can do that. Or the ability to, with a single touch, curse somebody with incredible ugliness, or kill with a touch. Yeah, they can do that, depending on the orientation that they have. Some of them are kind of laughable and won't apply in a lot of places. The balance is all over the place, as I've said before. If you're playing a Nereid, for instance, a nymph of the sea, and you're on dry land, because there's really not a lot of rules for swimming, although there are boating rules, which is fine. But if you're out and about and you're on dry land and I have cursed you. I failed my saving throw. What happens? Well, nothing. It just means that you're always going to fail any swimming check you try to make. Oh, better stay out of the bath then. So yeah, there's issues if you let them be issues. If you let yourself be ruled by the sentiments that you might have with modern games, you're going to find problems with this. You are. There are going to be some things that are going to rankle. If you can get by those things and just look at it as this is a free role-playing game, and this is kind of a callback to some of those earlier games, and it's pretty well done all in all. It's a little rough around the edges. The editing needed a little work. There's the promise that they could, keep developing it if you want. According to their mythical timeline, this is the 3rd revision of it, because it's 30 years past 1972 when they did this final version, I guess. I don't know. But for what it's worth, that part is fairly deep. Let's see what else. Legs are awful. The other thing, again, too, that you're going to have to get around if you want to play this game is the sex gating. You know, nymphs can only be female. There aren't satyrs to balance them out or something. They're females are females, and dryads or nymphs are all female. Centaurs are always going to be male. And that's just how this game is. Ignore it as you will. If you want to have male nymphs, I'm sure there's got to be some equivalent to it you can make. Okay, list of game. There's a lot of examples of game determination as opposed to player determination. Again, a lot of the things from leveling up and advancing, you don't have any control. The game tells you what you get periodically from time to time. If this is going to be a problem, then this isn't going to be a game for you. It does require a lot of buy-in. You really kind of have to like the idea of the culture or really have a good story that snares the players' attentions and allows them to not worry about things like leveling up and having choices of different powers and abilities, or leveling up and not feeling like you have to be even more powerful and more powerful and more powerful. You get small gains. And if some games, that's perfectly fine. If you can accept that, this might be a good game for you. The encumbrance rules are take it or leave it. Every game struggles with encumbrance. There's none that have a perfect system. They're just, it's there. Overall in the combat, it's pretty simple. You roll to hit. If you overcome their number, you roll a d6 for the damage. Some classes allow you to add one of your attribute modifiers to the damage, but it isn't automatic. You don't automatically do more damage because your character has a high might level. But if you are a fighting class, odds are the way that you attack most often is going to give you a damage bonus. For instance, I believe that Amazons in their archery, they get a bonus because of their skill whenever they hit somebody with an archery or a missile weapon. And that makes sense to a certain extent. Some people have a problem with all weapons doing the same damage. Honestly, a weapon can graze you or do maximum harm to you. And you can quibble about the maximum harm that a greatsword could do as opposed to a short sword driven into the guts. Either way, I can see all weapons that are designed for killing are capable of administering a mortal blow, so I don't really have a problem for all weapons doing the same amount of damage. And daggers that are somewhat less offensive only do a d3 damage, so d6 divided by 2 is fine. The extra damage that you do by using your preferred weapons that makes sense. It makes sense to me. I don't have a problem with it. All the classes that are warriors have a weapon of choice, and this is kind of cool. Weapons of choice have advantage to attack, as a person from 5th edition Dungeons & Dragons would understand. You roll twice, and you take the better roll. This was made before 5th edition Dungeons & Dragons, so kudos to you on that. Kudos. It's funny. So I find that to be pretty nice. It's a good way of adding a bonus without yet another statistical bonus. You roll twice, you take the better. That's really good. There are, to the best of my knowledge, I did not see any critical hit rules, and I'm fine with that. Maybe there are some in the Maze Master's Guide. I'm not sure. I haven't looked at that yet. Sometime down the road I might, but I'm fine without. Honestly, I don't need critical hits or critical misses. You can weave that in narratively, as game masters have for years. Like, what I'm fond of doing is somebody rolls a 1, you miss, and oftentimes are put at some sort of a disadvantage. You trip a little bit, the weapon turns in your hand, you lose an action. The more you dare, the more the penalty might sting. Whereas if you roll a natural 20, hey, maybe you do double damage. Maybe you knock the opponent down. Maybe you push them back and advance into their position if that's a strategic advantage, something that your character might do. Maybe you knock the weapon out of their hand. Something useful to them. Doesn't necessarily have to be extra damage, though. I'm fine with that, and Game Masters have been doing that forever. Serious injury can lead to your statistics decreasing. Yeah, there's long-term effects of taking grievous harm. That's something that's not all that common, although Dungeons & Dragons did have a rule that your constitution was affected with resurrections. There's no really a mention of resurrections in this game, honestly. I think maybe one of the dryads has an ability that can restore someone to life, but those are few and far between, and healing is slow and laborious, so this is a game that, again, harkens to fighting is not always going to be your first choice. Sometimes you're going to want to not fight to preserve yourselves a bit. And that, again, makes a lot of sense. There are some special tactics in combat to change things up. You can charge, which allows you to add your might bonus to both initiative and your first attack. Nice. You can form a shield wall to increase your defense. That's useful. And makes good tactical sense. Parrying rules are in here, yes. Holding back your opponent with a spear, again, just taking advantage of having a longer weapon than your opponent, yeah, it makes a lot of sense. And can put your opponents at a tactical disadvantage. Spearmen have those abilities just from the start, so spearmen are really good at that. Subterfuge. Having a character with a high amount of wits can allow them to use their wits to get an attack on an opponent that will give them a greater chance to hit with a feint or something, taking advantage of something they saw when they observed their opponent. So, different ideas on how you can approach combat. Very, very primal. Very, very raw. But it makes sense, and it works, and it's good enough to give a little bit of a difference in how you can approach one fight versus another, to give you a little bit of a range in how you can approach not getting killed and putting your opponents at disadvantages. I'm fine. Two-weapon fighting is in this game, yes. The ability to do subdual damage with unarmed combat, it's clunky and nobody does it really well, honestly. No earlier game really handled subdual damage great. And the wrestling rules are kind of garbage, just like they are for almost anything. Again, it's there because it's there. Yeah. And again, a note on the magic: it is very specific and it is very limited, but that's actually appropriate for the genre. That is how magic would be. It would be very thematic. It would be very tied into the concept of your character. Your priest would have divine powers that they would call in as miracles in their own way. Definitely not powered by themselves, but as a favor given to them by their honest worship of a deity. Your sorcerers have ability over men's minds, and they use their very feared powers to ensnare and confuse and enthrall their opponents, which could be an incredibly advantageous ability in the right circumstances if they use them. But on the other hand, you aren't going to have to sift through a spell list of 15 or 20 spells per level. None of that in this game. I actually find that to be refreshing and not a bad thing. I think it's actually a pretty good strength of the system, honestly. Not overwhelming if somebody chooses to play a wizard of some type, and none of them have to have pointed hats. So, again, balance. Don't worry about balance in this game. It's not going to happen. The ship's rules are fine. They have rules on boats because, Hellenic culture, they had a navy. They had boat travel. The land itself was, many of their greatest stories involved traveling off on boats. So the Iliad, the Odyssey, boats. A lot of stories involve boats, and so do these. So that's fine. There's fine and sensible rules for doing stuff. That's fine. Roll twice on a die, add this modifier, you're good. Did you hit the target you were shooting for? Awesome. It's basically the core of what makes games like Dungeons & Dragons so compelling. It's roll a die, find your target, did you hit it? You succeeded. If you didn't, you failed. On the other hand, this game is nothing more than pass or fail. There's no shades of gray in it. There's no failing forward or some of the things that are very trendy these days. It's very black and white. And for some, that's good. That's great. For some, you know, maybe that's something you house roll, you wiggle some things in if you've got experience in doing that. That's fine. Reaction rules are a thing. They've been a part of role-playing games for quite a long time. When you meet somebody else and you want to know how they're going to react to you, you apply your bonus and roll and see if they hate you or if they love you or somewhere in between. Fair. Rules on followers and attracting followers. Many heroes of lore had whole crews that supported them. Many of them died at the drop of a hat, let's be honest. And some of them were nothing more than to serve as a backdrop for how awesome the hero was. But they were there, and there's some rules for them here. They're fine. At least it's not as complicated as having to keep track of separate NPCs and stats. So, and in the end, also, one thing I do like about it, and I'll have to admit, the idea of glory being the accelerant that gives your character their power. How much glory they absorb increases their abilities in the minds of men and statistically. So not only is crushing a monster going to bring you glory, but also doing great things in the service of your trade also going to give you non-combat glory and experience. And I think that's actually really nice. I like games that have done that. And I always thought that the Dungeons & Dragons getting experience for the wealth that you pull out, I never was a huge fan of that. I know if you walk into a room and there's 1,000 gold pieces in there, you put it in your pocket, you walk out and get 1,000 experience. What did you really learn? Not much. So I like this, honestly, as a way of encouraging players to be more heroic and act heroically as opposed to being filthy murder hobos. Your characters are probably not going to be tied to a particular place. You're probably going to go outward in search of adventure in this game. So acting your deeds that are going to precede you, that are going to put your character in the minds of other people, become your currency and your trade in how awesome you are and how awesome you'll eventually be. And I think glory as a stand-in for experience is a really good idea. Yeah, it does kind of mean that in the minds of others is how, effective you're going to be. But in this game, I think it's appropriate. I think it's actually really a good idea that it's your glory that brings you up and elevates you up into the ranks of the heroes, as opposed to just another scabby neat adventurer. The rules only go up to so high, I think 5 or 6 levels. It's not something that encourages you to go up to 30th level, 40th level as a hero. You strut your stuff on the stage, you do some great deeds. Your character is then probably pretty content to go off and become a king somewhere, or walk off as a hero, or maybe even ascend to Olympus and become a servant of the gods directly. Who knows? That seems appropriate in this game, though. There's probably rules for that in the Maze Master's Guide. I haven't read it. I'm just going by what's here. But my sum up is this. Okay, you're not getting this if you want beautiful art. Fine. It's okay. It's primitive to okay. Fine. You're not going to get this if you want to have a game with a huge amount of choices for players. You have some race as class issues. Fine. You have some gender gating issues. Again, make of that what you will. But what you do have is a way of playing in a fashion that strips away a lot of the clutter that modern games get saddled with, and just leaves you to make a person who's going out and having a really cool adventure, hopefully. Your characters are stilted to be, your characters are kind of driven to be heroic to superheroic in terms of their stature among common men, but their deeds and what they're going to do against, scary monsters, and let's face it, Greek mythology is full of some scary, scary monsters, is really going to decide what people think of them. If they do celebrate their existence as heroes after they're gone, or if they're just going to be seen as somebody who went out and tried and are utterly forgotten in a forgotten grave or in the belly of some monster somewhere. Is it worth it? Well, it's free. I mean, it's worth a look. If you don't have another game, it's fine. Will this ever replace Dungeons and Dragons? No. No, it's simply not good enough of a game to stand on its own as a world beater, as the next great game. I only found out about it because David told me, hey, this is a game, I'm going to run this. You want to check it out? And I'm doing this. I did this, I read it, and it's okay. It does the job. Again, there's a lot of people who are going to be poisoned against this game because they're used to games with choice. They're used to games where their characters are going to accumulate great power. This isn't that. This just simply is not that game. And it's fine for what it is. It allows you to tell interesting stories. It has a place and a world that is recognizable, that players can buy into, and as long as they're okay with the premise of the game, they'll probably enjoy it a bit. Of course, a lot of it depends on your skill as a game master. This game is not going to make a feeble game master awesome. There's going to be a lot in it that you're going to have to bring your own craft to the table, unless there's something really special in that Maze Master's guide that I haven't seen yet. I have to believe that it's probably going to leave it very much in your hands on how to set up your adventure and tell a great mythic story. I think that from the characters that are here, from the systems that are in place, though, it might be pretty good. It might be pretty decent. There are some things that are definitely lacking, though. I don't see a great deal in here on how to do deeds that are epic in scope. Most of the things are very much on the hero level, but not the legend level. So, your characters are unlikely to be Heracles. They're simply not going to have that kind of strength, but they're unlikely to be Perseus. They are unlikely to be Jason. They are not going to be Achilles. They're just going to be the guy who was there fighting with Achilles. And again, you could probably have a lot of fun with that. But for some people who like games with more choice, you're not going to. For people who are opposed to some of the systems of the old school games, you're probably not going to like this one too much. So that's my fairest assessment for it. Would I run it? Yeah, I would. I wouldn't have a problem with it, but I'd probably run it in a very short time frame. Maybe a one-shot or enough to level you up to level 2, get you 1,000 experience on the table, and that's about it. I don't think I would want to run a long story with this unless something really inspired me that way. And if I had a story like that, I think I would probably choose a different game than this. But if you don't have a library of games, if you only have the internet on your side, well, it's not a bad game, and you might have a lot of fun with it. You might have to tinker with it a bit to get it just the way you want, but the groundwork is there, and it's functional. So that's my assessment on it. It is a fair game. And again, as far as value goes, can't beat free. So I'm Rob the Dungeon Tutor. Very likely bring this to many of you for the first time. So if you want to, just check it out, mazesandminotaurs.com. And David, thank you very much for bringing this to my attention. I appreciate it. It may be some time before I look into any of the other books, but the Player's book was kind of informative. And I hope that advice from all the rest of you on things that I haven't seen before and topics keep coming up, so that gives me plenty to reach out and share with the community and find things that little hidden treasures here and there that other people don't know about. So, thanks one and all, and I will see you next time for another session of The Dungeon Tutor. Until then, farewell.